Sounds good.
All right, I'm gonna let the people into the meeting and then we'll get started in just a couple minutes. Hi, good morning, everybody. So we are going to get started in just a couple minutes. So feel free to just kind of wait just a couple seconds and then we'll get going once we get more people in the meeting. All right, I think we'll get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our virtual talk. If you could please keep yourselves muted throughout the entire presentation, we will have a time for questions at the end. So you can either type your questions in the chat or just hold on to it till the end. And our speaker will be happy to address any and all questions or comments at the end of the program. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, hello and welcome to you all. You can also ask questions using the comments section. We'll be monitoring those and we'll see them in the chat at the end of the lecture as well. So do please note that the talk is being recorded and live streamed, and it will be posted to our Facebook or our social media channels at the end of the talk. Or at the end of the day. And then so you can rewatch any and all talks on our Facebook if you would like to see more talks like these. And I'm excited to introduce our speaker today, Mr. Bill Hardin, who is a docent at the museum, who's going to give a wonderful lecture today. So, Bill, here you go.
Thank you very much. Slide, please. Okay, Velázquez is said to be the most Spanish painter. And then the question can be raised about Carmen, Goya, El Greco. And it said, Velázquez represents something else, but I don't think the question is well taken, because look at Carmen, for example. Carmen is a French production. The opera, of course, is by Bizet. The book itself is by Prosper Mérimée, a French writer. And then Goya, the abandoned gaiety of Goya's dancing. Goya was a painter after the Bourbons had taken the throne of Spain. That's French too. And then even El Greco was a Cretan icon painter who went to Venice and became a Venetian mannerist, who then went to Spain because he wanted to get in on the decoration of the Escorial, this giant palace monastery that Philip II was building north of Madrid. He gets to Spain and Philip II didn't like his paintings. So to a certain extent, I think the question of challenging whether Velázquez is the most Spanish painter or not is somewhat misplaced. But anyway, we can have a look. We just want to look at a few of the paintings and see. And so for Velázquez, Now, Velázquez is a very unusual painter in more than one way. He, in other words, he became the painter in ordinary to the king, which was Philip IV. And the thing about that was that, so he does not have to seek commissions or anything. I mean, he's set for life, so to speak. So we'll show some paintings before he became the painter to the king. But he also, back then, painters were considered part of the help. I mean, they were classified with stonemasons and carpenters and bricklayers, whatever. But Velázquez actually was a member of the court. And so he, in other words, his status was ahead of most painters of the time. But we want to look at how Velázquez handles mythological projects. We want to mention the fact that he tended, the figures in his paintings tend to be portraits, not idealizations. And there are some other characteristics of Velázquez, in particular, his sober realism, dignity, and pride. Slide. Now here's a painting. This painting is listed in the references as a bodegon. It's a what? Bodegon. And so you say, well, what's a bodegon? You look it up in a Spanish-English dictionary and it tells you bodegon is a still life. You say, what? I would call that a genre scene. I wouldn't call that a still life, but the strange thing about it is that the Spanish definition of bodegon includes people. In other words, it's sort of bodegon, the Spanish definition is much, much broader than the English definition. But the Spanish definition talks about, it includes domestic articles. And so here we have an old woman cooking eggs. Now, an interesting thing about this, notice that the figures in this painting don't seem to relate to each other. They're not looking at each other. And there's another peculiar thing, well, not peculiar, but it's an artistic thing, that the perspective of the figures is on a plane with us. But notice the table in front of the older woman, the perspective is different. In other words, the perspective is inclined, and the artists to do this, Cezanne did it, but it's to make the articles on the table more visible to us. But notice, remembering that that even though bodegon is said to be a still life, it includes domestic articles, such as we have here. Of course, this is a painting made before Velázquez became the painter in ordinary to King Philip IV. Slide, please. Here is another one, the Water Carrier of Seville. Now, this is an interesting painting. Again, the figures don't seem to relate to each other except the glass. It's very hard to see in the slide, but the glass, the water is being flavored by a fig. It's very hard to see, but it's there. Notice the care in which the water vessels are depicted. And it's an interesting painting because when I lived in Spain back a long time ago, you could hear that these water sellers were in the streets even then. Agua fresca, agua fresquita. And so it's a very interesting genre painting from Velázquez before he became painter to the king. Slide, please. Now, Velázquez is not known for religious paintings. but this is the adoration of the Magi. And remember, the figures are portraits, not idealizations. And some of the commentaries remark that the Virgin in this picture, in this painting, is his wife. Now, Velázquez had entered at the age of 11 in the studio of a Francisco Pacheco, and he married Pacheco's daughter later on. And so that the Virgin Mary there is his wife. And that's the cutest baby Jesus I've ever seen. It's kind of hard to see in this particular slide, but it's really, really, and it's said to be actually one of Velázquez's children, perhaps even the little girl, but at that age it wouldn't matter. And so, but this is notice the very, very close arrangement of the figures, how close they are in the shallow space. The reason for mentioning this is that later on in his painting career, Velázquez his paintings will open up a little bit. But anyway, this is one of his religious paintings. There aren't very many of them. As a matter, Velázquez, since he was a member of the court, in addition to being a court painter, he was very busy arranging things. He didn't seem to mind that, but he didn't paint an awful lot of paintings. Slide, please. Now, we have talked about, I say we have talked, I've given talks, for Spanish Baroque painting. We've talked about this man here. This is Don Luis de Góngora, a poet. And we talked before about the fact that Góngora, as a poet, has given the English language a word, Góngorism, which means a highly affected style of painting. And I'm sorry, not painting, a highly affected style of diction and writing. Góngora was a poet, and he had written a sonnet about the tomb of El Greco. And I didn't understand it. And I taught Spanish for years, and I couldn't understand that sonnet until I saw a French translation. But anyway, one reason for showing this painting is that Velázquez had gone to Madrid hoping to get the attention of the king, and he painted this painting there. And this got the attention of some important people in Madrid. It didn't work. This is in 1623, I think. But anyway, he didn't get the king's attention during that visit, but he did get a lot of attention for this painting of the poet Luis de Góngora. And remember the English word Góngorism, which means this highly affected style of diction and writing. But anyway, he's on his way, so to speak. Slide, please. Okay, here we are. This is what Velázquez was hired to do. He was to be he's the painter to the king, and there he is. Now, the interesting thing about this, at least the interesting thing to me, they're the most famous Spanish poets in the early 20th century were Antonio Machado and, of course, Federico Garcia Lorca. Lorca is more famous, I think, than Machado, but Machado's older brother named Manuel Machado, and Manuel Machado, among other things, wrote poems inspired by the paintings of Velázquez. This in particular, that's the portrait. This is what, this is what his life was supposed to be, painting the king, Philip IV, King of Spain, a man who had no interest in ruling at all, a man who handed over the reins of government to the Conde Duque de Olivares, the Count Duke of Olivares, who was also from Seville and knew Pacheco. Remember, Pacheco was the man that Velázquez had studied art with. But here's a painting and the poem by Manuel Machado about, if not this particular portrait, it fits this portrait because it says, nadie más cortesano ni pulido que nuestro rey Felipe, que Dios guarde, siempre de negro hasta los pies vestido. And the translation of that, nobody more courtly or refined than our King Philip, may God bless him, always dressed in black from head to toe. It goes on to describe how his pale, this you can see in the painting, his pale complexion, pale as the afternoon, the poem says, es pálida, pale, pálida, su tez como la tarde, cansado el oro de su pelo undoso, y de sus ojos el azul cobarde. That's an interesting thing. And the translation is, his complexion is as pale as the afternoon, and his wavy blonde hair is lank, and the blue of his eyes cowardly. It's rather unusual. I wonder if you can see that. You can see his hair. This, he's a Habsburg. How did the Habsburgs even, does anyone remember that if they've seen the earlier lectures, remember Catherine of Aragon, everyone knows who she was. Well, Catherine of Aragon had a sister, an older sister named Juana de Castilla, who married a Habsburg. That's how the Habsburgs got into ruling Spain. And we talked about the fact that the Golden Age in Spain, and Spain was becoming really, really prominent in the arts, and yet politically, it was quite a disaster. And it was during the reign of Philip IV in particular that things really got bad. But here he is in all his glory, so to speak, the King of Spain, painted by Velázquez. And so now things begin to change, and we're going to see in the next paintings that we look at are different things, and we'll have some comments about that. Slide, please. Okay, we talked about, this is a triumph of Bacchus. And one thing about Velázquez I find is interesting, his paintings are so famous in Spain that they have nicknames. And this one, I'm sure a lot of people will understand what the title is. This painting in Spain is called simply Los Borrachos, the drunks. And so look at the painting. In other words, you've got Bacchus crowning somebody, but notice the figures. There's a satyr to his right, but the other people in the painting, those are just ordinary Spaniards, 17th century Spaniards. And the guy in the middle in particular is looking right at us. And of course, this is a Spanish painting. So look at the guy in the upper right. What is he doing? It's a beggar, holding out his hand. But this is the thing about Velázquez and his paintings of mythology. There's mythology in the central figure, but the other figures are ordinary 17th century Spaniards. And we'll see this again, but if you've just been to the Prado, remember this painting. It's a very, very interesting painting. The Los Borrachos, the Spaniards call it. Okay, slide. Here's another one, the same thing. What are we looking at? Apollo and the Forge of Vulcan. This is in the Prado too. My daughter was born in Spain, and we took her back there in 1998. This was her favorite painting in the Prado, Apollo and the Forge of Vulcan. But again, The mythological figure, there's Apollo on the left, but the figure of Vulcan and his assistants are 17th century Spanish. And of course, the armor that they're working on is 17th century armor. But look at Apollo. He looks like a schoolyard tattletale, this prissy Apollo telling Vulcan that, Vulcan, does anyone know who Vulcan's wife was? Vulcan was married to Venus. And here's this prissy Apollo telling Vulcan, oh, guess what? You think your wife is at home doing her domestic duties? No, she's out fooling around with Mars. And look at I don't know how well you can see it, but the expression on Vulcan's face, this wary incredulity, you might call it, and the looks on the faces of the other people in the painting. But this is, again, this is typical of Velázquez. In other words, his mythological figures are people of 17th century Spaniards. But I really, really, really like the look on Vulcan's face as he's listening to this prissy Apollo telling tales on what his wife is up to. Slide, please. Okay, here's another. Now this is called the surrender of Breda, but this one also has a nickname. This is called Las Lanzas. In other words, for that, militarily speaking, all those are really pikes. But anyway, it's called Las Lanzas. And here you have the surrender of Breda. This was painted in 1635. The point being to have Velázquez was not the only painter doing this, but it was to paint a series of Spanish victories during the reign of Philip IV. Now, the battle itself, the surrender of Breda is in Holland. And remember how the Spaniards were involved in Holland, because it's this Habsburg thing. In other words, when Catherine of Aragon's sister married Philip the Fair, Philip the Fair's father, Maximilian, was the Holy Roman Emperor, and he was married to Mary of Burgundy. And Burgundy back then included the Low Countries. That's why. And so when Catherine of Aragon's sister had a son, Charles, who became the Holy Roman Emperor, in addition to being the King of Spain. That's how all that ties together. Okay, so who do we see here? We see the Justin of Nassau handing the keys of the city of Breda, Breda's in southern Holland, over to Ambrogio Spinola. He was actually he's Italian, but he was a general, working for the Spanish. And the thing about this, among other things, is notice how now the two central figures, Justin of Nassau's head is lower. He's the one that's defeated. But then Spinola notice how kind he's being to the man he has defeated. You might also notice that the painting is sort of split right down the middle. The orderly Spaniards, the victors, on the right, and on the left, just people more or less in disorder, and a wounded man. If you see the man to the right, to the left, as we look at it, of Justin of Nassau, the guy in white, it was a wounded person. And this is a very interesting painting, the Surrender of Breda, also called Las Lanzas. And it's a very, one of the, notice that this also was in the Prado. And of course, the conquered city behind and the smoke rising. It's like stuff we see on TV today happening in Ukraine. But this is a war. Remember, the battle itself and the surrender took place 10 years prior to the painting of the picture. Next slide, please. Notice portrait of Innocent X. Now notice this painting's not in Madrid, but this is a masterpiece of portraiture. Now why Innocent X? Notice it was painted in 1650. Well, Innocent X, before he was Pope, he was a papal nuncio in Spain before he was Pope, and so that's one reason. But look at the man's face. They say that he was an intelligent and kind man, but also temperamental. And wonder if you can see anything about that in his face. It's hard to tell from a slide like that, but it's a very, very famous one. In other words, Velázquez, after he became painter to the king, was primarily a portraitist. And this is of portraits in world art. This is one of the better ones. Look at the look in his eyes. Velázquez himself said that he didn't paint things the way they were. He painted what they looked like. And they say, well, how can you tell it? Well, it has to do with the brushwork, and it's hard to tell from a slide. But anyway, that's one of the things that it has to do with his rendering of detail. There's no meticulous rendering of detail. The brushwork is lucid than that, but it's what things look like, not exactly as they are. It's a hard distinction to make, but I think an interesting one. And slide, please. Ooh. Now this is listed as his only surviving nude. I said, well, I've been reading about Velázquez for a long time. I have never heard of any other nude that he ever did. But anyway, this is his only surviving nude, and that makes it one of only two surviving nudes in all of Spanish painting, at least from that period. There's Goya's Naked Maja, and we call it the Rokeby Venus. It's in the National Gallery in London. Somebody took to it with a hatchet in, I think, 1912, really did a lot of damage to it. But anyway, this is, in the Spanish, they call it La Venus del Espejo, Venus of the mirror. Notice that her face is not very clearly shown. A lot of speculation. Who posed for this? And the black sheet, these black taffeta sheets, were said to be a favorite of an actress of that time, although it was not. I've never seen any attempts to mention who she was, but that is the one of only two nudes. And as I say, the sources say only surviving. I've never heard of any other nude painted by him. And remember, the other nude in Spanish painting is the Maja Desnuda by Goya. But anyway, here is a painting by Velázquez. And I would ask your opinion. How old do you think the model is to pose for that? And there she is, of course, with a little cherub there holding a mirror. And so, slide, please. Okay. Portrait of Mariana of Austria. Who was Mariana of Austria? She was Philip IV's second wife. And I don't know if you can tell from this about her, what kind of a person she was, but the descriptions of this painting, look at this enormous farthingale she's wearing. In other words, part of Velázquez's job was to paint this. And this, remember, this is the most formal court in Europe at the time. Notice that monstrous wig she's wearing. Mariana of Austria, and oh, that's spelled wrong. It says Marina. No, portrait. No, it's Mariana. Sorry, the label is somehow gotten. Okay, Mariana, and does anyone remember what islands are named for her? The Marianas Islands in the Pacific, Guam, Saipan, the whole chain of islands there that mark the eastern boundary of what's called the Philippine Sea. In other words, the Pacific between the Marianas and the Philippines. And so there she is in that enormous farthingale. And it's called Guarda Infante in Spanish. But that's the portrait of Mariana of Austria. She was Philip IV's niece. And so you've got all this inbreeding going on in the Habsburgs. They kept, when I tried to figure out the genetics of what happens when a person marries their niece, but it got me all confused, and so I gave it up. But anyway, you might remember that the person who followed Philip IV to the throne was Charles II. And he was rickety, stunted, we can't use, what do you say now? Mentally challenged, I guess. He was on the throne for 35 years, marked a total, absolute decline of Spain. But anyway, that's Queen Mariana. This was painted in 1652 or about. Slide, please. This is Velázquez's most famous painting, Las Meninas. Las Meninas is a nickname for it. I think it's probably called the Ladies in Waiting. And their names are known. Remember, Velázquez in his paintings painted people, identifiable people, and the names of the ladies in waiting. This is, if you've been, the last time I was in the Prado, this painting was displayed with a mirror, and museum visitors were invited to look at the painting in a mirror to get an idea. And they say this, the sources say that this is the most analyzed painting in all of the history of painting, about what's going on, what are we looking at. But as for the people that are in it, of course, the central figure is the king's daughter. Now, people got really confused somehow with this. In other words, Philip IV had two wives. His first wife was a French princess, and he had a daughter by that one, and then he had a daughter by Queen Mariana. This is Queen Mariana's daughter, and that's Margarita Teresa. And I guess I don't need to mention, but of course, Manuel Machado wrote a sonnet about her, and I think it refers to this painting. And he says, in the poem, they were talking about Spain's decline, Italia, Flandes, Portugal, poniente sol de la gloria, el último destello en sus mejillas infantiles posa. And what that means is that Italy, Flanders, Portugal, the setting sun of glory, it could see the last gleam of the setting sun of glory in her little girl cheeks. In other words, painted that way. And her august forehead is crowned by the golden ash of her hair, held lightly in place with a pink bow. So I think that poem, and notice that again, this farthingale, and then now the ladies in waiting are let's see if I've got the names here. As usual, the lady in waiting to the right, as we look at it, her name is Doña Isabel de Velasco, and the other lady in waiting who's kneeling and offering La Infanta, a dish, her name is Maria Agustina Sarmiento de Sotomayor. The names of the dwarfs that the Habsburgs like to have around for their own entertainment. See them off on the right. Maria Barbola, the woman there, the dwarf woman who's not much taller than the princess herself, and then Nicolas Pertusato, as he was an actual Italian. But anyway, the man in the back is actually, he is the princess's chamberlain. I'm sorry, the queen's chamberlain. And so he said, what is this painting about? What are we looking at? He said, there's Velázquez off to the left of this huge, huge painting. It's so big, it's not even on an easel, it's sitting on the floor. He said, what are we seeing here? Okay, well, the usual explanation of what this is that he is painting the king and queen, and they can be seen. I don't know if you can tell. Can you tell there's a mirror in the background with two indistinct figures? In other words, that's supposed to be reflecting where we're standing. In other words, we're standing where the king and queen are posing for their portrait, which Velázquez is painting there on the side. And the forgot what I was going to say, but so anyway, and the princess Margarita Teresa has come in to observe with her ladies in waiting, perhaps to distract the king and queen from being bored and having to sit for their portrait. However, the other commentaries said, now wait a minute. Velázquez never did paint the king and queen together. And so then an alternate thing, I said, look, what this is not Velázquez painting the king and queen and the little girl having come and the little princess having come in to distract. He's actually painting the little girl, and the king and queen have come in to observe. And so who knows what makes sense in explaining this? I think he's supposed to be painting the king and queen. Now, God, you can't see it in this slide, but the remember, we talked about this before. Velázquez was wanted very, very much to improve his social status, and he wanted to be a member of the order of Santiago de Compostela, the Order of Santiago. And that was one of his goals in life. And this painting, which you can't see it in this slide, but has the cross of Santiago on his jacket, or whatever you call it. It is said that the king himself painted that on the painting after it was done, although he was not a member at the time it was painted. But that's an interesting side note. And so it's really unfortunate that the slide it's not very distinct. I mean, there's only one person in there whose name isn't known, because there is a person standing behind. And I don't know if there's a nun standing behind the standing lady in waiting, and her name is Marcela de Ulloa. But there's a man who is probably a bodyguard for the princess, and nobody knows who that is. But anyway, the man in the door in the back is Jose Nieto Velázquez, perhaps a relative, not sure. But anyway, this is of Velázquez's paintings. This is the most famous, the most analyzed and discussed of any painting in the world, some people say. And so we have one more painting, which I included. I'll tell you why. On the slide, please. Oh my goodness, what's going on here? Mercury and Argus. And then there's a bovine creature there, a cow or bull or something. What in the world is going on? Well, this is, again, we're back to mythology. And like one of the other mythology paintings, it has to do with Jupiter fooling around. And in one case, it's pronounced, her name is Io or Eo, I don't know. Io, I guess, is the English pronunciation, just two letters, Io. And Zeus, or Jupiter, whatever you want to call it, is fooling around with her. So his wife, in other words, Jupiter's wife, decided, I'm going to put a stop to this, and turns Io or Io into a heifer. In other words, a young cow. And Jupiter says, I'm not going to, and the idea was, so she decides that she is going to take Argus had 100 eyes, and they were, and one, at least several of them were always open. In other words, he put Argus to keep an eye on Io. And Jupiter says, well, I'm not going to put up with this. Hey, Mercury, remember, Mercury was the messenger of the gods. And we can tell who Mercury is. He's got that winged hat. But look what he has in his hands. It looks like a machete. It's a sword or something. Anyway, Jupiter says, I want you to go. You put Argus to sleep. You can do it. You can do it with your caduceus, that wand thing, the herald's wand that Mercury carries. You can do it. Put him to sleep and kill him. And that's what Mercury is getting ready to do. He's got the sword in his hand. It looks like Argus has finally fallen to sleep. Mercury's going to kill him. And in other words, he's supposed to be watching. In other words, Juno got Argus to watch Io because he was never, ever fully asleep. And so Jupiter sends mercury to kill him. And that's what that's about. And so this is the, I don't have any more things to show. If there are questions, I will try to answer them. And I will certainly admit it if I don't know the answer. And so that is the end of the presentation, the slides. Thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you so much, Bill, for that wonderful lecture. So if any of you have any questions or anything about the lecture, Bill will be happy to let you have some answers and all that kind of stuff. So feel free to unmute yourself or just send them in the chat and we will answer them right away. Ryan S. asked, any idea why there were so few nudes in Spanish art for such a long period of time?
Well, think about this. Among other things, remember Francisco Pacheco, who was Velázquez's main teacher? He was a consultant to the Inquisition on matters of art. And the nudity was not considered a proper subject. In other words, I'm surprised myself when I read about that the Rokeby Venus, or La Venus del Espejo, is the only surviving nude. I was surprised to see that because I've never read of any others. The nudity was just not allowed. It's a church thing in the Inquisition. And so, and imagine, remember, Pacheco was an advisor to the Inquisition in matters of art. And so it's a religious thing. Oh, God. That's a very good question. Thank you very much for that.
Giselle asked, can you recommend a book to brush up on Greek or Roman mythology?
Yes, it's called Bullfinch's Mythology. I've got it right here, just one second. This is here's the book. Can you see the title?
It's upside down.
It's reversed, but anyway. That's it. And this one is the best one I know of. And it's published. Bullfinch's Mythology, Illustrated, The Age of Fable, The Age of Chivalry, Legends of Charlemagne. And it's probably considered outdated, but it's a very good one. And after all, the mythology stories don't change that much.
Awesome. And then Pablo asked, are there surviving writings from Velázquez, and what do these writings show about his personality?
Well, not very much. And that's an interesting thing. There's a lot written about him, but there's not much around by him. Very little, as a matter of fact. that mention is made of that in the sources, that there's really not much, not very much at all. As a matter of fact, he went so far as to say there are no letters at all left over by Velázquez, only his paintings. But he's a very, very, there's something real special about Velázquez and the way his handling of paint, and especially that thing, as we said, that he doesn't paint things the way they are. He paints things the way they look. It has to do with brush strokes, and there's very, very little available. That's fine. if anything at all.
And then Diana asked, what can you say about his assistant Juan de Pareja? I think his name is.
Juan de Pareja is he was a very interesting person because he was a black man, and he was I'm sorry not to have included a portrait of him by Velázquez. Juan de Pareja himself was an accomplished painter, and Velázquez freed him because he started off as a slave, but then he was freed. And if I ever give this again, I'm going to make every effort to include Velázquez's portrait of him. Juan de Pareja, very, very interesting person, and a quite accomplished painter in his own right.
And then Ryan asked, does the Prado have the largest number of Velázquez, or which museum has the most?
Let's see. Well, a lot of them are there. They're mainly in Madrid. There's some others around. Of the ones that we've seen, not all are in there's one other museum in Madrid. I've forgotten the name of it, but they're mainly in the Prado, I think. But I say not all the ones that we've seen today are there. The Rotby Venus, for example, is in London.
And then Diana asked, who lived longer, Velázquez or King Philip IV?
I think Philip.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Velázquez died in 1660. Philip was about 7 years younger than he was. I'm glad you brought that up, because it reminds me I need to look that information up. But remember, the king was younger, a bit younger than Velázquez. So Velázquez lived to be about 60 or something. I think he was. As a matter of fact, I think I read that the Cross of Santiago was painted on that painting by the king himself after Velázquez died, I think. And remember, the painting was painted in 1656. And, Velázquez didn't live much longer after that, 4 years. I don't remember. I should remember, because Philip IV was the next to last of the Habsburg kings. And then his son, Charles II, who was so inbred as to be incapable of ruling or doing much else for that matter, although he was on the throne for 35 years. And then the War of the Spanish Succession, and guess who gets the throne of Spain? I mean, Spain's history during the Habsburg period was fighting against France. And if you look at Philip II, Philip II constructed the Escorial to celebrate a victory over the French. And then the 30 Years' War occurred during Velázquez's life, and the end of that established France as a nation state in Europe. It separated the Spanish Habsburgs from the Austrian Habsburgs. And anyway, it's that's something I should have looked up. As I meant to, I get myself sort of confused with these two things.
All right, and then we have a few questions from Facebook as well. Debbie asked, was Velázquez influenced by Caravaggio in his?
Yes, well, this is interesting too. Now, the question is, yes, because I hope I didn't make a thing of it, but I hope you noticed that of the slides that we showed, the early ones were the ones with this Caravagesque tenebrism, right? In other words, that after and I didn't stress the fact, Velázquez had made trips to Italy, and and his palate lightened. But the thing about his interest, his influence by Caravaggio is not exactly direct. Now, it's true that Velázquez painted the first bodegones, and some of the first bodegones that vague definition that is sort of cross between the genre scene and still life, or a genre scene with still lifes in it. But that the Juan Sanchez Cotan, now there's a painting by him in the San Diego Museum, Juan Sanchez Cotan, who was a contemporary and was this Caravaggesque tenebrism, it's called, showed that. So I think in Velázquez's case, it's not a direct influence, but it's more indirect, but it certainly is influenced by Caravaggio. Yes, yes.
All right, and then Amy asked, so many European paintings have ended up in American museums. What was the social, political reasons that Spain retained so many of their Velázquez in the state?
Well, I think one reason would be that Spanish paintings in general, there are exceptions, but in general, did not become known outside of Spain until after the Napoleonic era. And you say after the Napoleonic era, we're already into the 1800s. Velázquez himself wasn't that well known outside of Spain until then. I think that's got something to do with it. Although that in my opinion, that's why that has something to do with it. And it's true for other painters too, with the exception of Murillo. Now, Murillo was famous outside of Spain, even during his own lifetime. And I would imagine Rivera too, because Rivera, although he was a Spanish painter, he lived in Italy. True, he lived in a part of Italy that was part of the Spanish Empire, but he is it's rather and look at Zurbarán. Zurbarán wasn't known to any great extent outside until Napoleon's marshals started stealing his paintings and taking them to France. And so I think that's part of it, but I don't really know.
All right, and then Sylvian from Facebook asked, in the Surrender Breda, it is unusual to the rear end of the horse and not the head. Any known reason? The positioning of the horse or the look of the horse?
You're talking about the Las Lanzas? Why is the back end of a horse the most promising thing there? It has to do with an engraving. What I did with it, there's an engraving that it is said that Velázquez based this painting on. I have it here somewhere. I can't find it now. But anyway, there's an engraving, and there's a horse like that in that engraving that it is said that. Taylor, did you have that handy? The picture of that engraving?
It would take me a bit to get to it.
No. I've got it here somewhere, but if anybody were to walk into this room, I would have to say, I will not apologize for the mess, because that would imply exception. What you see is the rule. And it's here somewhere, but I would hate to have to try to find it. But anyway, it's the engraving that it is said the painting was based on is like that too. I'm not sure I answered the question. The question was, why was there a horse's back end so prominent in the paint? Was that it?
I believe so.
Okay, good. In other words, it's the engraving that it's based on.
Got it.
I see, if I do this again, I'll include that right after the painting. I meant to have it in there, then I forgot to bring it up.
All right, and then Halu asked, did Velázquez only paint royal subjects after he became part of King Philip's court?
Well, some of the paintings after slide number 5 was Philip IV. And there were paintings other than the royal family after that. In other words, there was the Feast of Bacchus, the Forge of Vulcan, the Surrender of Breda. Those were subjects. And Innocent X himself, a portrait of a man who was the papal nuncio in Spain before he was a pope. But he did paint other things. And the Rote de Venus itself, that was painted in 1651. And he painted other things, but mainly he painted Philip IV about, I think, 7 or 8 times. And one interesting thing about his initial painting is lost. And in other words, the first painting he ever did of Philip IV was lost until it was discovered. It was found when they started X-raying paintings, it was discovered that a subsequent painting of Velázquez of Philip IV had been painted over the first one. And the comment is, it's really strange. Philip IV was not a very handsome man. And the original painting, he didn't look he just wasn't a very attractive person. And Velázquez painted over it. And this wasn't discovered until a long time later, but it's interesting. And, Velázquez has said that his sober realism, but in the case of renderings of the king, he wanted to make him look more regal than real. And so we say that one of his characteristics was he painted what it looked like, not what it was. That is generally true, but in his renderings of the king, for example, he lengthened his neck, made the pose more balanced, and he just cleaned it up a little bit. It's really interesting, the story of that.
All right, and then Diana asked, were Velázquez and Sanchez Coten friends?
I think they knew each other. I think I read that.
And then AP said, thank you for your enthusiasm and incredible expertise.
You're very, very welcome. I am enthusiastic about it. My expertise. I seem to have forgotten some things. Oh, that's one main point I will bring up. The painting of the Rote de Venus, in other words, seen from behind. This reminds me of, there's an Ovid. It says, spectentur tergo quis sua terga placent. And that means, let them be seen from behind, those who have nice backs. And so, thanks for bringing that up.
All right, well, I think we will end it up here. I'd like to give another big thank you to Bill today for this wonderful lecture. And if you would like to watch this lecture again or any other previous lectures, check out our Facebook page or other social media channels to watch previous talks. And we will see you next week for another wonderful lecture. Thank you, Bill. And have a great rest of your day, everybody.